Well, I just want to say welcome again. Thank you for tuning in to North Point online, wherever you're at. If you are in your living room, if you're sipping coffee on the patio, maybe you have a bowl of Lucky Charms like Buck talked about last week. For me personally, I'm more of a Fruity Pebbles kind of guy. That's where I would be right now. But if I haven't met you yet, my name is Jeremy, and I'm part of the service programming team here at North Point. And all that means is I have the privilege of working with an incredible team of people to create the Sunday morning experience each week, and that includes what happens here at North Point Online. And last week, we kicked off a brand new series called Signs. And Buck was here for part 1. He's going to be back for part 3. But the reason that we started this series is because of this assumption that when it comes to Christianity, or just when it comes to religion, that it's really all kind of an emotions or experience type thing. But what Buck talked about last week, and you got to go back and listen if you haven't already, but he ended with this idea that Christianity is not about just believing or taking it by faith. No, that there's more to it than that. At the core and at the root of Christianity is the evidence surrounding the Christian faith. And we looked at some of these pieces of evidence, and we're really honing in on one specific piece of evidence, a historical document in this series. And that historical document is called the Gospel of John, written by, no surprises here, but written by a guy named John. And John was a first century follower of Jesus. He followed Jesus around during his ministry. And then later on, he wrote down the things that he saw and the things that he experienced and what he heard in the Gospel of John. And towards the end of it, he actually tells us exactly why he wrote these things down. He says this, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written," in other words, here's the purpose behind them, "so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." And so John says to his audience, which today is you and I, he says, hey, I've written and recorded these things and what I've heard and what I've seen so that you can learn about them as well. This person of Jesus, the implications that he has in your life, and your life can change as a result. And so last week we began by looking at the first sign, and all of these signs that John records ultimately lead up to the resurrection, the ultimate sign, the launch point of Christianity. And today we're going to be looking at the second sign that John talks about, that he writes in his gospel. But to do that, what I want to do is I want to share a little bit of a personal story with you. And it's going to get us into this second sign and the idea of where we're going today. You see, to be honest with you, I have a little bit of a fear when it comes to flying in airplanes. And this isn't like a debilitating fear or anything. Like, I'll still go flying, but I just don't really like it that much. I get a little bit anxious. I'll check my watch. My heart rate goes up a little bit when I'm sitting there on the airplane. Because what happens is we might get a little bit bumpy or we hit turbulence or something. And I always find myself looking out the window at the engine thinking like, we're going to go down. It's going to be lost all over again. But what happens is the pilot will come on the intercom and he'll say, hey, I just want to let y'all know it's going to get a little bit bumpy. And I always think to myself, like, what does that even mean? Like, how is the air bumpy? But this tends to happen. And then I find myself like gripping the armrests. I'm looking up and down the aisles, looking for the flight attendants to see if their faces have panic on them. And then I look over at my wife, Ashley, who's sitting next to me, and she's usually doing like a coloring book, listening to Post Malone while she's doing it. And this always plays itself out whenever we go on airplane rides together. But a couple of years ago, my brother texted me, and knowing about this fear that I have in flying, I had this in mind as I received this text. He texted me and he said, hey, do you want to go skydiving with me? And I remember reading the text, and I reread it a couple times, and then I just locked my phone and put it in my pocket, and I chose not to reply. But then he texted me again and again and again. And finally I said, fine, I'll go skydiving with you, thinking there's no way it's not going to happen. I don't have the time. We don't have the money. We're not going to do that. And then one day he texts me and he says, hey, are you good for Saturday? And I thought, good for Saturday? What are you talking about? And he said, it's really cool. I just sold my laptop to a guy on Craigslist who is actually a skydiving instructor, and he's going to give us 2 free jumps because I sold him my computer. And I just thought to myself, well, that's fantastic. I literally have no excuse at all at this point. And so I said, okay, I guess I'm good for Saturday. And so I show up at his house, and we drive out about an hour outside of Austin, and we show up to this warehouse. And sitting next to this warehouse is this little plane, if you could call it that. It was really more of like a piece of cardboard with wings, and it looked a lot like this right here. Yeah, it was a little biplane. And this thing was tiny. And I crossed my fingers that this was not the plane that we were going to jump out of. But it turned out to be that it was. And so we go inside of this warehouse and we meet the instructor, and he tells us all these things about safety and the chute and the parachute and all these things. And then he looks at me and he sees that I'm a little bit anxious, and he says, "Hey, don't worry, I've done this 8,000 times." And I just think to myself, well, that's not helpful at all, because statistically speaking, the chute is more likely not to pull the 8,001st time. But it's getting real at this point. Peer pressure has fully weighed in, and we're doing it anyways. And so we go out to the plane, we load up, the plane really shakes as it takes off, and I begin to panic a little bit. My palms get a little bit sweaty. And what's cool is we paid for the whole GoPro package thing, so we had a GoPro capturing us the entire time. So I can show you exactly what I was feeling as we were going up and up in the air. Here's what I looked like. Yes, it's not a flattering image by any means, but this is how I felt. This about sums up how I felt in this moment. I was terrified for my life. I was terrified for what was going to happen. But we kept going up, and finally we get up to about 10,000 feet in the air where we're going to jump from. And the pilot turns around and he looks at me and he says, "Hey, I just want you to know that if this plane goes down, that you're going to be okay because you have a parachute." And I just thought to myself, these guys are horrible at making their customers feel comfortable. But then he slid open the door, and we pulled our feet out, so we're hanging over the open air. And the guy that I'm strapped to, he pulls back and he pushes off, and we go flying down to the earth at 147 miles per hour. And it was actually, on the other side of it, I can say, after the chute pulled, I can say that it was actually a blast. It was so much fun. Here's an image that I captured right in the middle of our jump. It was so much fun. It was crazy. After the chute pulled, I was so relieved. But the reason I share that entire story with you is because of what was going on in my head when our feet were dangling over 10,000 feet of open air. Because there was this thing that just kept playing itself out over and over again in my brain, and it was a version of something like this. God, if you just come through right now, then I will believe. I prayed like I've never prayed before, to be honest. I told God, hey, I will be a better husband. I'll eat better. I'll exercise more. God, I'll go to bed earlier. God, I'll watch less TV. God, whatever you want, if you just come through right now, I will believe like I never have before. And I just essentially was bargaining with God in this moment that I felt like my life was right on the edge. And my guess, my hunch, is I'm not the only one who has reacted to a situation like this in this way. Because isn't it true that when we face situations where our life feels a little bit like it's on the edge, that we kind of look up and we go, to whom it may concern, if you're out there, I really hope you are. Will you just come through for me right now in this moment? And it starts with much smaller things, probably throughout our childhood and growing up. There's that boy or that girl that we have a crush on, and we just say, God, if they like me back, I'm going to know that you're real for sure this time. Or there's that test that we have to take at school, and we say, God, I know I didn't study. I know I haven't paid attention in class, but if you just come through for me right now, I'm going to know you're real for good this time. And we might say things like that growing up, but then we get older, and the stakes of life get much higher. And all of a sudden, we find ourselves facing much more real life situations. Perhaps it's a financial scenario where something happens and it feels like the rug is pulled out from underneath us, and we're trying to figure out where to go. Maybe it has to do with our job. Maybe it's a relationship that's been broken, and we don't know how to put the pieces back together. Maybe it's health-related or the potential looming loss of a loved one. Or maybe it's just what is happening right now, today, in our current world, where we don't know what tomorrow holds. And it's like all of a sudden we're right on the edge of life and we're not sure what is going to happen. You see, I think we all find ourselves in these type of situations at one point or another. And life is fragile. These moments are so fragile, but I think in the midst of these moments, we are all faced with a question. And it's a big question. That question is this: what do you really believe? What do you really believe? Is there really a God? How do we know for sure? Does God really love us? Or maybe you're a Christian and is God really faithful? Are his promises really true? Does he still have the whole world in his hands? Is he still going to come through for me? See, we go through these situations in life, and normally life is pretty good because normally we have good health and we have a pretty good lifestyle and we have pretty good income relative to the rest of the world. But then all of a sudden when we find ourselves in this situation, it's like this question is staring us directly in the face. And to be honest, I think that this is one of, if not the most important question that we can answer in our entire life. And the reason is because of the implications. There are so many implications to how we answer this. Because what we believe in ultimately drives everything that we do. Our belief drives the way that we live, the way we think, the way that we talk, the way that we parent, the way that we manage our finances, the way that we react to external circumstances. Our belief drives inherently, whether we know it or not, everything that we do in the way that we live. And I know this isn't rocket science, but the reason I bring this up is because of what has happened when it comes to belief in the past decade. You see, if you've ever filled out a religious questionnaire or a survey and it's had a religious question on there, it usually asks, what is your belief system or what is your religion? And there are all these boxes, and next to all these boxes are all these different answer choices. And then at the bottom there's a box and there's an answer choice next to it. And that answer, there's a word there, and that word most likely is none. None. No belief system. And what's crazy is in the past decade, the amount of people who would check none on this type of survey or questionnaire has risen to about 1 in 4 people. And these people, ironically, have come to be known as nuns. Nuns. But here's the problem with this, and I'm not trying to call out nuns. I know it's just a survey. I know it's just a questionnaire, but here's the problem with this line of thinking. We all live our lives and make decisions every single day, whether we know it or not, based on an inherent belief system. Why? Because everybody believes something. Everybody believes something. Even an atheist who says, I don't believe there is a God, still holds that to be their belief system because everybody believes something. But, and here's my point with this, not everybody believes something on purpose. Not everybody believes something on purpose. We go through life and we grow up, and one day we get a job and we get married and we have kids, and perhaps one day we retire and then we pass away. And today's modern day society, it is relatively easy to go through life and just check the none box. But then we find ourselves in a situation where life feels like it is on the edge and we are faced with a question. We are caused to wonder what we really believe in. Perhaps that's why some of you came to church in the first place. Maybe it's why many of you are watching online today. Or maybe you have a belief system, but you just have questions, and sometimes you're brought to these life situations where you wonder whether or not it's really true. Wherever you're at, my hope for you today, and really in this series and throughout your life, is that you would have a belief system, and that you would have a belief system on purpose, and you would live your life on purpose because of it. And the reason that's my hope for you is because I personally think that there is something amazing on the other side of us honestly answering this question in our life. And so today we're going to look at this question a little bit deeper, but to do that, we're going to look at the second sign that Jesus does, because this second sign speaks directly into the question of belief. So we pick it up where John left off last week. Here's what John writes. He says, once more, Jesus, visited Cana in Galilee, where he had turned water into wine, You see, this was the first sign that we talked about last week. And after this happened, Jesus went south. Israel is kind of this vertical country, and Jesus went south to Jerusalem, and he went there for the Passover festival, a Jewish festival. But because he was so controversial and people were hearing about him, it became dangerous for him to stay there. And so he went back north towards Cana in Galilee. He made a few famous stops along the way. But what was happening is he began to gain a following as all of this was occurring. And John actually writes a couple of chapters earlier what was going on. He says this, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. See, people were flocking to Jesus. Many people were beginning to believe that he really was the Messiah, the Son of God. Even people in Galilee, where Jesus was from, and people just thought he was crazy because they watched him grow up. Even people in Galilee were flocking towards him and believing that he really was who he claimed to be. And so Jesus goes to Cana in Galilee, but it's different this time because all these people are around him. And John describes what is happening at the beginning of this second sign. He says this, "And there was a certain royal official whose son lay sick at Capernaum." You see, the first sign started with a wedding, a celebration. The second sign starts with a tragedy. But there are two really important pieces of information that John gives us in this short sentence. The first is this word Capernaum. This was a place that was about 8 hours away from Cana, and it was about a 3 to 4 hour horse ride, an 8-hour walk, and so it was really far away for somebody to make the trek all the way to see Jesus. But not only this, but John writes that this was a royal official. This man was very successful, very wealthy in a time where the poverty gap was so big. But not only that, I think that John includes this piece of information because John is trying to show us that this man's social status did not exempt him from the tragedies of everyday human life. Because while this man can normally command a room full of people, today, on this day, he is a terrified father, scared for his son's life. So when this man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee from Judea, he went to him and begged him to come and heal his son, who was close to death. I would imagine there's a conversation between this man and his wife, and they're kind of out of options at this point, and they're worried and they're concerned about their son who could potentially die. And so I bet his wife looked at him and he said, "Listen, you go get that man Jesus that we've been hearing about. I don't know if he can do it, but you go get him and you bring him back here so that he can heal our son." And so he makes the trek all the way to Cana, and then when he gets there, he begs Jesus to heal his son. But you see, there's a crowd around Jesus at this point because of this following that he is attracting. And so Jesus looks at the man and he looks at the crowd around him and he says this, "Unless you people see signs and wonders, you will never believe. Unless you people see the miraculous, you will never have any sort of faith." But this man is really just focused on one thing, and that is his son. And so this man turns to Jesus and he says, "Sir, come down before my child dies. Sir, come down before my child dies." See, normally, sir, I'm above you in society, but today I am beneath you. I just need your help. And this man does what many of us would do if we were in his shoes and there was even a sliver of hope that we could save our loved one. He looks up and he goes, "To whom it may concern, I don't know if you can do this. I don't know if you're real. I don't know if you're out there, but would you just come through for me in this moment?" And you see, it's not difficult at all for us to relate with what this man is feeling right now. Because at the core of this man's fear is an uncertainty when it comes to the future. He doesn't know if his son is going to live or die. He doesn't know what his life is going to look like and how it's going to impact him. And I think that when it comes to what we feel right now in our current world and our current cultural climate, I don't think there's a better word to describe what that is than uncertain. Because today, a day feels like a week. A week can feel like a month. Thinking about our world a month from now feels like it is so far off from the distance, we don't know what tomorrow holds, and there's so much uncertainty and anxiety and fear and worry as a result. And so this man sees really only two options. Either option one, he brings Jesus back with him and maybe his son will live. Or option two, he doesn't bring Jesus with him and surely his son will die. But you see, Jesus always did the unexpected. And Jesus had a third option in mind, an unexpected option. And he looks at the man, and here's what he says. He says, "Go." Jesus replied, "Your son will live." To which I bet this man thinks to himself, no, Jesus, you don't understand. My wife didn't give me that option. If I go back without you, there will be 2 deaths in my family today. But he says, "Go. Your son is going to live." And this word "go" in the original Greek translation literally means just go on your way. Don't hurry. Don't worry. Just go. And you see, in this moment, Jesus was both demanding unquestioning faith from this man in his word without giving any evidence for his word being true yet, while at the same time he was promising healing for this man's son. He was doing the very thing that this man asked him to do. And in this moment, this man is faced with a question that all of us are faced with at some point in our life. And that's this: what do you really believe? What do you really believe? And this man takes a step in the direction of Jesus in this moment. He takes a step in the direction of something unknown. He takes a step in the direction of faith. Look at how he responds. The man believed the word Jesus spoke and went on his way. He trusted that what Jesus said is true, and he took a step in the direction without any evidence yet. And look at what happens. While he was still on the way, his servants met him with the news that his boy was living. His son was alive. Jesus' words were true. But he begins to wonder, okay, was this Jesus or was this more of just a coincidence? And so when he inquired as to the time when his son got better, they said to him, yesterday at 1 p.m, the fever left him. Then the father realized that this was the exact time at which Jesus had said to him, your son will live. Look at this. So he and his whole household believed. His entire household, they are faced with the evidence and they cannot look away. And as a result of what has happened in this man's life and this family's life, he and his whole household believe, and their lives are changed forever. And then John wraps up this incredible story with this last sentence. He says, this was the second sign Jesus performed after coming from Judea to Galilee. There's another story of a modern-day individual by the name of Francis Collins who has faced a very similar question at a pivotal moment in his life. Francis Collins is a geneticist and a physician. He's a brilliant guy. He is credited with leading the project behind mapping the human genome. And the human genome is essentially the DNA sequences that make up our biology and our bodies. And so he's a brilliant individual, but growing up for him, he was an atheist. He just looked at whatever science could tell him to be true, and anything other than that, any sort of religious system or belief, he just looked down upon people who thought those things. And then he was in medical school when he was 27 years old, and he found himself on the other side of patients who had a sort of faith. And these patients, many of them, had terminal illnesses. They were facing death. And even in the midst of death, they still had this unquestioning faith. And he found it to be so puzzling to him. He describes it this way: if faith was just a psychological crutch, it must be a very powerful one. If it was nothing more than a veneer of cultural tradition, why were these people not shaking their fists at God and demanding their friends and family stop all this talk about a loving and benevolent supernatural power? It was just puzzling and confusing to him. And then one day he finds himself on the other side of a woman. And this woman had this type of unquestioning faith, and she'd shared so much about her story with him. And she's close to death, and she turns to him and she says a question. She asks him a question. She says, "Doctor, what do you believe?" "Doctor, I've shared all these things about what I believe, but what do you believe?" And looking at this woman in this emotional moment, Francis Collins says that he realized that he had never believed in a God, but he had never actually looked at the evidence. He never even looked for any evidence either way. He never made a decision about what he believed in on purpose. And so he says, because of this question, he says, faced with my willful blindness and arrogance, I began a journey. And he began a journey to discover what he actually believed in. And he went to the first resource that he could think of, a man named C.S. Lewis, who went on a similar journey trying to discover what he believed in. And he did a series of radio talks that were written in a book, that were recorded down in a book called Mere Christianity. And so Francis Collins knew about this book. He knew about C.S. Lewis's story. And so he picked up the book and he began reading it. And in just the first few pages, he says that every argument that he had ever made about there being no God was fully flawed. He had never even looked at the evidence, and as he began to look at the evidence, he realized that all of his arguments were flawed. And so he kept reading, and he didn't just look at C.S. Lewis books. He looked at so many other resources. He looked from a scientific approach, from a physics side of things, from a space side of things, thinking about the Big Bang and all these theories about creation and the world and the universe. And at the end of all this, he came to the conclusion that there was ample evidence to support there really was a God. But there was still a question about Christianity. And so he began to look at the historical evidence surrounding the person of Jesus. And what he discovered, one day he found himself in the mountains of Oregon, away from all the distraction, after all of this searching and all of this trying to discover what he believed in. And he said, based on the evidence, away from the distraction, he placed his faith in Jesus Christ. It's an incredible story of one man's journey to honestly and objectively answer this question for himself. That's Francis Collins' story, and that's the story of the royal official as well. But I want to turn it around to you in our remaining time. And I want to ask you, what do you really believe in? What do you really believe in? Perhaps you're watching this morning and you know what you believe in and you are rooted and solid in your belief system. Or perhaps you're watching this morning and you would say you're a Christian, but you just have doubts and questions and you're not sure sometimes. Maybe you're in process and you're trying to discover what that is. Maybe it's why you're watching this morning. Or maybe for you, if you're honest, if you're objective, deep down you would say you've never really answered this question in your life. If that's you, if you're in that last category, then I just want you to lean in for a second because I want to talk to you specifically. Because I want to challenge you with something. 300 years ago, there was a man who lived named Blaise Pascal. He was a French mathematician and physicist. He was another brilliant guy. And he had this set of writing called Blaise Pascal's Wager, where he essentially talks about whether or not God exists or not and our decision to actually believe or not in a God. And he writes this. He says, God is or is not. God is or is not. At the end of the day, there is really only two options that we have. We can only really believe that there is a God and a higher power, or there is no God, there is no higher power. And then he goes on. He said it is not optional. It's not optional. Why? Because it doesn't matter what you feel. It doesn't matter if it's emotionally satisfying or emotionally dissatisfying. It's not optional. This is about what is true. He says, you are embarked. Which will you choose then? He says, you are embarked. It's this idea that you are already living your life based on an underlying set of belief. Think about it like this. If you were to come to me one day and you were to say, Jeremy, I want to take a trip to Colorado. I would be so excited. I love going to Colorado. I love the mountains. It's where I'm from. I would be like, yes, I want to go with you. But I need to check on some things. I need to figure it out. And then you were to come back to me a couple of days later and say, hey, do you want to go to Colorado with me? And I'd say, I'm still trying to figure this out. And then you come to me a week before it's time for the trip to start. And you'd say, do you want to go? And I'd say, I don't know, I'm still trying to figure it out. And then one day you would show up on my doorstep and your bags would be packed, the car is running. And you'd say, Jeremy, do you want to go to Colorado? Now is the time. It is a yes or a no. And you see, at this point, if I were to say, I don't know, I am inadvertently saying no to your question. Because at this point, if I say I don't know, you are going to leave without me. And that is Blaise Pascal's point. He is saying that a lack of belief is unbelief. That we are all already living our life based on an underlying set of beliefs. And if we choose to avoid this question because it's uncomfortable, because we're not sure about it, because we don't know how to answer it, we are essentially saying by the end of our life that it is unbelief. A lack of belief is unbelief. And I don't want that for you. And so let me ask you again, let me lean in one more time, but take it a step further. When it comes to belief, what do you really believe and why? What do you really believe and why? Have you made a decision about what you believe? Have you looked at any evidence? And if so, what have you found? If not, why haven't you done that yet? Would you be willing today to take a step in the direction of faith, just like Francis Collins did, just like the royal official did in his life? I'm not saying you have to have it all figured out, but perhaps today it's as simple as just opening up the Gospel of John and reading about the life of the person of Jesus. Maybe it's reading Francis Collins' book. It's called The Language of God, where he talks about his own story. Maybe it's reading Mere Christianity, the one that Francis Collins read that changed his life. Or perhaps it's just tuning in online over these next couple weeks as we continue to unpack this series leading up to Easter. Wherever you're at, I would say don't sit still anymore. I want you to answer this question for you and your life because I believe it's the most important question you could possibly answer. And for me personally, my hope for you is that you would find what I have found, that there is evidence surrounding the person of Jesus and he can change your life forever. So what do you really believe and why? Now, if you're watching and you're a Christian, then I have a little bit of a different question for you. And that is this: what do you really believe today? What do you really believe today? You see, every day we wake up and we are challenged to trust again that what God says about us and our lives is true. And perhaps today you woke up, and because of what is going on in our world, what's going on in our lives right now, there is a question of what you really believe. Perhaps there's a situation that you are facing right now. Maybe it is a financial situation, and you don't know where the light is at the end of the tunnel. Maybe it has to do with your job. Maybe it has to do with your health or worry or concern. Whatever it might be, I think we would all agree that there is a big question mark in our lives and our world right now. But you see, Jesus, I think in the midst of that, I think Jesus would look at you and he'd look at me and say, yeah, I know all of that's going on. I know this is happening. But even in the midst of that, what do you really believe today? Are you letting fear and panic and worry and concern and anxiety drive your life today because of what is going on in our world? See, what's so interesting is that Jesus could not have been more clear in what we were to expect in our life, because Jesus said this. He couldn't have been more clear. He said, in this world, you will have trouble. In this world, you will have trouble. There will be uncertain times in your life where you are not going to know what tomorrow holds. But in the same breath, he says this. He says, but take heart, for I have overcome the world. He looks at you and he says, hey, I'm not saying everything's going to be okay. I'm not saying it's not going to be a long road ahead. I'm not saying everything is going to turn out the way you expected. But in the midst of everything potentially not going okay, he says that your heart and your soul, that you are going to be okay. He says that if you would just walk with me, if you would just abide in me, if you would just keep in step with me, he offers you a peace that transcends all understanding. But it really comes down to what you really believe today. You see, I think in these times of uncertainty and unknown, when we don't know what tomorrow holds, that we have a tendency to lose sight of what is on the other side of our willingness to trust Jesus moment by moment. Because we lose sight of the joy and the peace and the happiness and the contentment that he offers to you and he offers to me. And when we lose sight of that, we essentially stop being the church. We stop being the hope of the world. But right now, in our current modern day times, we should be a place that people look at and they go, man, the world is going crazy and there's so much unknown, but those people have so much peace. They have so much love. What is going on? But I think sometimes when we find ourselves on the edge of a situation like this, that we need to be reminded of our willingness. We need to be reminded to trust Jesus in these times. And so what I want to do to end our time today, whether you're watching online and you're not sure what you believe in, I just want to create an opportunity for you to take a step in the direction of faith. Or if you're watching online and you know what you believe and you're a Christian, but you need to be reminded of this in this time, I want to create an opportunity for you to do so. We're going to end with a song. And this song has incredible lyrics, and the music is such a helpful reminder for us to continually choose to trust and take a step in the direction of Jesus, regardless of what is going on around us.
When this life is overwhelming and I feel like giving up, will cling to all you've promised. You will always be enough. When the world around me crumbles and it's hard to understand, I will run to you, my shelter. I am safe within your hand. You are my help forever. I will not fear. God, you are with me. I know you're near. You'll never leave me. I will trust in you alone. When I've broken in the silence, I can hear you whispering. You're not alone here in these trials. I will hold you faithfully. And you are my help forever. I will not fear. God, you are with me. I know you're near. You'll never leave me. I will trust in you alone. And when my heart and strength have failed me, my God, you won't. Your name is mighty. I will trust in you alone. And you are a fortress for the weak, the strength that carries me when I am on my knees. The cross reminds my heart to trust your faithfulness and love will always be enough. And you are a fortress for the weak, the strength